How can a man be free if the system that frees him still owns the shape of his life? Rome forced that question into law. Not poetry, not philosophy first. Law. A slave could be released from ownership. He could receive citizenship. He could take a Roman name. He could build a business, handle money, manage contracts, even rise close enough to imperial power that senators had to pass through men like him to reach the emperor. The clean version turns that into progress. The record is colder. Rome did not make manumission powerful because it was merciful. Rome made it powerful because controlled freedom is useful. A slave with no path out has only endurance, escape, or revolt. A slave with a visible path out can be made to work toward the master's profit, the patron's prestige, and the state's body of citizens. That is the first ugly precision in the Roman system. Freedom was real. It was also engineered. Gaius, writing in the Institutes, Book 1, does not present freedom as a sentimental rescue. He lays out legal categories, persons, status, methods. A human being moves from one legal condition to another through recognized procedures. Manumissio vindicta, manumissio sensu, manumissio testamento. The words are dry because Roman law preferred dry words for violent realities. A slave could be freed before a magistrate through the formal touch of a rod, the vindicta. A slave could be enrolled in the census and publicly entered into the civic body. A slave could be freed by a will, receiving liberty from a dead master who had kept the labor while alive. Each method carried a different social temperature. Vindicta was public. A magistrate, a ceremonial rod, a legal fiction that the person was being claimed for freedom. The scene turned a change of ownership into a civic act. Census enrollment was bureaucratic. The slave entered the count of Rome. A body once accounted for inside a household could be entered into the registration of the state. Testamentary manumission was colder. A master could reward loyalty after death without surrendering the labor while alive. The slave's future could be written into a will by a man who still owned the present. The procedure mattered because the result mattered. A formerly freed slave could become a Roman citizen. That was not ordinary in the Mediterranean world. In many Greek cities, freedom did not automatically produce full civic belonging. A freed person could remain a metic, an outsider inside the city, taxed and registered and exposed to challenges. The former master could remain necessary as a protector. The city could accept the labor without opening the civic body. Rome built something stranger. Rome could take property and turn it into a citizen. Not equal, not clean, not unmarked. Citizen. The difference was enough to change behavior. A person who saw the legal road ahead could be made to move down it. The master did not need to become kind. The state did not need to become modern. The machine only needed the road to be visible. That road often began with a fiction. Roman law could call the slave property. Res. A thing in the legal order. A body owned by another household. Yet practical Rome made room for something messier. A master could allow a slave to manage money, property, commercial activity, even other slaves. That managed fund was the peculium. Legally, it belonged to the master. Practically, it could become the slave's working life. The peculium is one of those Roman details that sounds technical until the shape becomes clear. A man who owned nothing could manage enough value to buy himself. He could run accounts. He could trade. He could accumulate. He could bargain for the price of his own release. The master lost nothing noble in this arrangement. He could receive payment for the slave's freedom. He could recover value from human property. He could buy a younger replacement. He could turn years of obedience into one more profitable transaction. The slave could move. The master still set the road. That is not a contradiction in Roman thinking. That is the design of the system. Rome did not have to deny ambition. It could harvest it. It did not have to crush hope. It could price it. A person inside bondage could begin acting like an economic agent before the law fully treated him as a person. Praetorian practice could recognize transactions around the peculium. Third parties could bring actions connected to a slave manager's business. Commercial life forced cracks into legal theory. The slave was property. Therefore, the master owned the fund. But the fund could buy the slave. Rome loved that kind of arrangement, impossible in principle, profitable in practice. Then came freedom. And freedom did not arrive alone. The freedman, the liberatus, did not step into an empty field. He stepped into patronage. The former master became the patronus. The freedman often took the former master's family name. The legal chain was cut, but the social bond tightened into a different form. Obsequium, allopera, dona, respect, services, gifts or payments. The vocabulary changed. The obligation remained measurable. A freedman owed formal deference to the man who had owned him. He could owe days of labor. He could owe support. If he died childless, his estate could return upward into the patron's line. Freedom had a surname, and very often that surname belonged to the old master. Then there was the mark, no ceremony erased. The macula servitutis, the stain of slavery. A freedman could become wealthy. He could become useful. He could become feared. He could become indispensable. He could not become unmarked in the eyes of Rome's old hierarchy. High public office remained blocked. The senatorial order remained closed. The old families could accept his money before they accepted his blood. That matters because the popular version wants a ladder. Rome gives you a leash with rungs. The freedman climbed, but the law kept record of where he began. The patron kept record. The name kept record. The marriage rules kept record. The offices he could not hold kept record. That record did not prevent wealth. Freedmen became traders, contractors, managers, lenders, agents, and patrons of their own clients. Some built houses. Some left monuments. Some entered the economic bloodstream of the empire with more force than men born free but born poor. The old mark did not stop movement. It shaped the ceiling. A modern story wants release to erase the past. Roman status did not erase. It archived. Augustus saw the archive becoming crowded. The first emperor inherited a republic's ruins and tried to harden Roman society into order. Manumission had become common enough, visible enough, politically useful enough, and socially disruptive enough that the state began tightening the walls around it. The lex fufia canina limited how many slaves a master could free in a will. Not because dead masters had suddenly become too generous for moral comfort, but because mass testamentary manumission could flood the citizen body and create large client groups attached to elite names. The lex alia sentia imposed age rules. A master had to be at least 20. A slave generally had to be at least 30 for standard manumission to grant full citizenship. Younger cases required formal justification. Certain punished slaves could fall into the category of dependency, free but permanently denied civic rights. That category matters. It proves Roman citizenship was not treated as a human right waiting to be recognized. It was a prize filtered through age, conduct, procedure, and the state's judgment of social usefulness. The lex papia blocks senators and their descendants from marrying freedwomen, prostitutes, or stage performers. Marriage law is never only about marriage in a status society. It controls inheritance, family name, bloodline, and the future composition of the ruling class. A wealthy freedwoman could bring money into an aristocratic household. Augustus's law kept that kind of crossing under imperial prohibition. The wall was not imaginary. Law does not guard boundaries nobody approaches. The old aristocracy did not fear poor men in chains. It feared the people who had left the chain behind without becoming socially harmless. A freedman with wealth, education, contacts, and a patron's name could move through Rome in ways the older order had not designed for comfort. Augustus did not abolish the road. He narrowed it. He marked who could walk it. He kept the prize visible and the gate controlled. Then, the empire created a larger problem than aristocratic discomfort. Rome had to govern. Not a village. Not a city. An empire. Britannia to Syria. Provincial taxes. Military correspondence. Petitions. Mines. Estates. Grain. Legal appeals. Officers. Money moving across distances too large for the old Republican style to manage cleanly. The emperor needed administrators. The Republic had relied on aristocratic competition, public office, and old habits of prestige. The Principate needed something more private and more reliable. The emperor's power claimed to preserve Republican forms while concentrating command around one household. That household needed clerks who could read, calculate, draft, archive, and obey. The men born to rule were the problem. Senators had lineage, clients, names, ancestral images in their houses, public legitimacy. A senator placed over too much money, too much correspondence, or too much military access could become more than an official. He could become an alternative. The emperor needed capable men who could not become emperors. The Familia Caesaris solved the problem. The emperor's household of slaves and freedmen became more than a household. It became a government inside the government. Men who had been property or had recently left property could handle the machinery the aristocracy wanted but could not be trusted with. A rationibus handled imperial finances. Ab Epistulis handled correspondence. A libellis handled petitions. A cognitionibus handled judicial preparation. Do not soften those offices. The treasury is not a side room. The fiscus could eclipse older state finances because the emperor's private resources became inseparable from public government. Correspondence is not paperwork in the weak sense. Military appointments, provincial communication, diplomatic messages, and imperial answers moved through letters. Petitions decide who reaches the ruler. Legal briefs shape how imperial judgment appears. The men in those offices did not merely serve power. They touched the levers. The old families could sneer at them. The emperor could use them. The empire could run through them. Their weakness was the credential. The macula servitutis barred them from senatorial legitimacy. Their past made them unacceptable as rivals. Their dependence made them safe. If the emperor fell, his freedmen fell with him. Their fortunes had no independent political base strong enough to replace the throne. So the emperor could give them what he could not safely give a senator: money, letters, petitions, access. The title says slaves became powerful men. That part is true enough to attract attention. The documented structure is sharper. Rome did not forget they had been slaves. Rome kept the mark visible, and that mark made them useful. The paradox is not decorative. The men who could not fully escape the stain could stand closer to imperial machinery than aristocrats who claimed cleaner blood. The insult became a function. The disqualification became a security feature. Power came through the very mark that kept them beneath. Rome even gave freedom a shape a person could wear. The pileus was a brimless felt cap associated with liberty in Roman visual culture. A freedman could wear it after manumission. A small object. Almost plain. Nothing like a crown. Nothing like armor. A camp. There is a humility in that detail the big machinery cannot give. Law could declare a status. A patron could claim respect. The state could count a new citizen. But the street needed a sign. A man who had been owned could cover his head with the mark of release. Not because Rome had become gentle. Because status had to be seen. The pileus did not erase the past. It announced a passage. It told the public that something had changed, while everyone who understood Roman society also understood that not everything had changed. That is the Roman mechanism again. A symbol of liberty that still lives inside a world of rank. A public sign that says free in a city that keeps asking, free how far? Claudius made the arrangement visible. His reign placed imperial freedmen in positions that senatorial writers could not discuss without irritation. Narcissus, serving as ab epistulis, handled correspondence and moved near military and political decisions. During the crisis around Messalina, ancient accounts place him at the center of the action against the empress. Callistus, another freedman, moved through the inner machinery of the court. Pallas controlled finance. Senators wrote the history. Freedmen had handled the levers. The answer became unbearable when men like Pallas reached the top of the administrative ladder. Marcus Antonius Pallas began as an enslaved man in the household connected to Antonia Minor, the mother of Claudius. Under Claudius, Pallas became a rationibus, the financial secretary of the emperor. That office placed him near the imperial treasury, estates, revenue, and the economic skeleton of the state. Senators could call him a freedman. The treasury still passed through his office. In 52 CE, the Roman Senate voted to grant Pallas the ornamenta praetoria, the insignia and public distinctions of praetorian rank. It also voted him 15 million sesterces. 15 million. Pallas declined the money and accepted the honors. Decades later, Pliny the Younger encountered Pallas' tomb and could barely contain the layered disgust of the old order reading its own humiliation in stone. In Epistles 7.29, Pliny quotes the inscription, "To him, because of his loyal services to his patrons, the Senate decreed the honorable distinctions of praetorian rank together with 15 million sesterces, but he was content to take the distinctions alone." Pliny tells his correspondent that the reaction will be to first laugh, then feel annoyed, and then laugh again. That sequence is not admiration. It is the sound of an aristocrat finding documentary proof that Rome had praised what Rome claimed to despise. A former slave had been offered a fortune by the Senate. He had enough to refuse it. The Senate then praised his restraint. Public honor can humiliate the person giving it. Pliny went further in Epistles 8.6 when he examined the decree itself. He found the language of praise too much to bear. The old masters of Rome had recorded their deference to a freedman in official form. Pliny's phrase cuts because he knows exactly what it says about the room, the imperious command of a freedman in the presence of the Senate. Not a slave market. Not a revolt. A Senate chamber. The humiliation did not come from chains being broken. It came from hierarchy being forced to speak against itself. Pallas did not need to become emperor for the wound to open. He only needed the senators to need what passed through him. The backlash eventually became administrative. By Hadrian's reign, the highest offices that had once been dominated by freedmen were increasingly transferred to equestrian officials. The emperor's household bureaucracy hardened into a more formal state service. The door that had let men like Pallas become nearly ministerial figures did not stay open in the same way. The old order adapted after being humiliated. The record of the humiliation remained. That is one kind of power. Epaphroditus gives the darker kind. Epaphroditus was also a Greek freedman. Under Nero, he served as a libellis, secretary of petitions. A petition is not a small thing when the emperor is the destination. It is a request for justice, mercy, favor, survival, permission. A libellis controlled access to the channel through which desperation approached the ruler. That office made Epaphroditus powerful. It also made him an instrument of other people's desperation. A petitioner did not approach a libellus as an equal. He approached the channel. The man who controlled paper controlled whether pain entered the imperial field of vision. A former slave could become the doorway through which freeborn Romans begged. It also placed him beside catastrophe. When Nero was declared a public enemy in 68 CE, ancient sources record Epaphroditus near him at the end. Nero fled. The imperial image collapsed into a private death. Epaphroditus aided Nero's suicide. That act did not disappear into the past as service completed. Years later, under Domitian, Epaphroditus was executed because he had failed to prevent a sovereign's death. The same proximity that made him useful made him vulnerable. Near Nero, he was close enough to assist the emperor's final act. Under Domitian, that closeness became a charge that could kill him. Access did not protect him. It preserved the evidence against him. That is the part ambition refuses to look at directly. The door closest to the ruler opens both ways. Favor can become exposure. Knowledge can become liability. Service can become guilt when the ruler changes. Epaphroditus had office, access, and proximity to imperial power. He also owned a slave. The slave's name was Epictetus. The tradition says Epictetus came from Phrygia and was physically lame. The famous story that Epaphroditus broke his leg exists, but the evidence is debated. Other accounts point toward illness or childhood condition. The honest version leaves the broken leg scene where it belongs, uncertain, unusable as proof. No theatrical torture scene is needed. The stable fact is strong enough. A powerful freedman owned the man who would become one of Rome's clearest voices on freedom. Epaphroditus allowed Epictetus to study under Musonius Rufus. Epictetus was later manumitted. He survived the purges under Domitian, left Rome, and taught at Nicopolis. His words survived because Arrian recorded them. That chain of preservation matters. Epictetus did not leave a polished literary monument in his own hand inside this tradition. A student preserved classroom speech as discourses. The text does not feel like a marble system. It moves like a teacher pressing a student until the student stops hiding behind terms. In the Discourses, Book 1.26, Epictetus returns to Epaphroditus not as a villain in a revenge story, but as part of a hierarchy turned inside out. A wealthy Roman throws himself at Epaphroditus' knees. The man says he is ruined because he has only 1.5 million sesterces left. Only. Epictetus does not need to invent poverty for the scene. The number does the work. The man still has wealth beyond ordinary reach. Yet in the scene, he behaves like a ruined man because his measure of safety has moved beyond any amount he can hold. Epaphroditus does not laugh. In Discourses, Book 1.26, Epictetus gives in these words, "Poor man, how did you manage to keep silence? How did you endure it?" The line is cruel if heard as social comedy. It is sharper as diagnosis. The rich man is kneeling before a former slave who became powerful enough to receive that kind of desperation. Epaphroditus appears higher. The rich man appears lower. Epictetus, the former slave of Epaphroditus, records the scene from another plane entirely. He owns nothing in the way Pallas owns wealth. He controls no imperial petitions. He has no senate praising him in stone. Yet the discourses place the slavery elsewhere, not in the legal status only, in the dependence. The rich man depends on wealth to tell him he is safe. Epaphroditus depends on imperial proximity to keep him powerful. Senators depend on access while pretending to despise the men who provide it. The emperor depends on servants he can trust because their stain keeps them controllable. Every layer has someone above it. Every layer has something it fears losing. Epictetus had been at the bottom of that structure. His body had belonged to another man. His movement through the world had been controlled by status before philosophy ever touched the subject. Therefore, when his teaching turns toward what belongs to a person and what does not, it does not sound like an exercise in elegant detachment. It sounds like a man refusing to confuse access with ownership. The court could give office. The patron could give freedom. The Senate could give honors. The emperor could give proximity. Fortune could take every one of them back. The discourses do not need the fake internet sentence often attached to Stoicism. The real passage is stranger and better. A man with 1.5 million sesterces left is treated as an object of pity. A former slave hears the scene and records the slavery inside it. The hierarchy does not vanish. It reverses. Not socially. Rome still has its ranks. The wealthy man still has money. Epaphroditus still has office. Epictetus still carries the history of enslavement and bodily limitation. No one in the scene becomes equal because the philosopher speaks sharply. The reversal is independence. The man with money is begging. The man with office is still bound to the court. The former slave is the one naming the condition. Do not clean this up too quickly. Stoicism did not abolish Roman slavery. Seneca makes that impossible to ignore. In Moral Epistles 47, Seneca writes about slaves as human beings sharing the same air, subject to the same fortune, made of the same mortal substance as masters. He condemns cruelty and excess inside the master's house. He turns the moral damage back onto the owner. That letter matters. So does the life around it. Seneca was no abolitionist. Historians do not treat him as a man trying to dismantle the slave system. He was wealthy, vastly wealthy. His world depended on the same structures he could criticize with moral brilliance. The contradiction is not a reason to throw away the text. It is the reason the text must be handled without perfume. Roman Stoicism could see the humanity of the slave. It could also leave the institution standing. That is not a small flaw hidden at the edge. It is the condition in which the philosophy lived. Rome's thinkers could internalize slavery, speak of men enslaved to lust, luxury, fear, ambition, and greed, while actual slaves still carried water, worked estates, managed accounts, and waited on masters. The inward turn is powerful. It is also limited. A person enslaved in law could hear Stoic language about inner freedom and still remain enslaved in a Roman house. A master enslaved to luxury could be morally exposed by that language while keeping the keys. The philosophy cuts inward with real force, but it does not open the locked door by itself. A script that calls Roman manumission equality is lying. A script that calls Seneca a clean hero is lying. A script that makes Epictetus into a warrior who physically defeated his master is lying in a more childish way. The record gives something harder. A society built on human ownership created legal roads out of ownership for some because those roads served the system. Some freedmen used those roads with extraordinary force. Some became rich. Some became administrators. Some made senators bend their language. Some stood close enough to emperors to touch imperial death. and one formerly enslaved philosopher looked at the whole ladder and placed bondage somewhere the ladder could not reach. The Pallas returns here because stone keeps what argument loses. Freedmen did not only live this transition, they displayed it. The cap of liberty appears in Roman visual culture, including freedmen funerary monuments and reliefs. The mausoleum of the Hetairai, around the turn of the 2nd century, preserves that world of self-presentation, status, craft, wealth, and freed identity. A freed family could put the sign of liberty into stone, not hide the origin. Record the passage. That choice is easy to sentimentalize, so keep it plain. The stone does not prove Rome was kind. It proves freedmen understood the public power of memory. A person once treated as property could arrange the signs by which later eyes would read his household. The Pallas on a monument is not a soft symbol. It is a legal wound made visible. It says that the person or family crossed a line Rome cared about. It says the old condition did not vanish into private shame. It entered public display. The same society that kept the stain also gave men language to carve the passage out of it. There is no clean emotional category for that. Pride is there because the monuments speak in public. Constraint is there because the symbols only make sense inside the system that once owned the person. Memory is there because a family chose to preserve the transition rather than bury it. Stone does not flatter easily. The ending cannot be simple. Rome's freedmen were not fake successes. Pallas' power was real. Epaphroditus' access was real. The offices of the Familia Caesaris were real. The money, honors, petitions, correspondence, and proximity were real. The dependency was real too. A man can rise inside a system and become more tightly bound to it. A man can gain access and become easier to destroy. A man can receive honors from people who hate him and still need the honor because the room decides what honor is. A man can wear the cap of freedom and still carry the old patron's name. The Roman case is not a motivational ladder. Ladders are too simple. Rome gives a man steps, prices, marks, patrons, offices, honors, and risks. At each height, the question changes form but does not disappear. A man can have 1.5 million sesterces left and kneel like a ruined slave. Epictetus does not ask the scene to become inspiring. He leaves it ugly enough to work. The wealthy man at Epaphroditus' knees is no longer a joke. At the start, the number made him look absurd. Only 1.5 million sesterces left. Enough to make ordinary fear look ridiculous. Enough to make the whole scene sound like Roman comedy written by a bitter philosopher. Now, the number is not the center. The kneeling is. Epaphroditus had stood close to Nero. Pallas had stood close to Claudius. Senators had stood close to Pallas when they needed the machinery he touched. Freedmen had stood between slavery and citizenship, between household and empire, between stain and office. Every position looked higher than the one beneath it. Every position still depended on something that could be taken. You do not kneel before Epaphroditus. You do not wait outside the office of a libellis with a petition in your hand. You do not wear the Pallas after a magistrate's ceremony. Your name does not record a Roman patron. The structure is less ancient than the clothing. If safety depends on approval, the patron is still there. If status depends on access, the court is still there. If worth depends on a number that can rise and fall, the 1.5 million sesterces are still there. If freedom means only that the chain became invisible, Rome already had a word for that kind of arrangement. The body can be released by law. The mind can keep kneeling.